Okay, can you hear now? Oh, you can hear me now. Okay. I had to get my technical support to come help me. Sorry about that. It's just always something's going to go wrong. Okay, so I'll start over because you guys didn't hear anything I said before. Okay, so this is my third live stream, and obviously I've not overcome all of the technical difficulties in getting these things going. So the first two live streams I did were just Ask Me Anything Q&As. And this week I am going to try doing something different, which is to give a little lesson on short rows first and then open it up for your questions after that. So a lot of you are here. I'm so glad. I'm so glad I didn't keep going with the sound problem. So I just want to look over. I have some housekeeping. Oh, so if you have a question about something, you can put that in the chat, but start it off with the word question and put it in all capital letters. That just makes it easier for me when I'm going through looking to see if anyone has any questions I haven't answered. That makes it really easy to find them. So what I'm going to do is, let's see what else I have. Oh, I wanted to let you know that I do on my channel, I have tons of videos on my channel, and I put every video into at least one playlist. So some technique videos might appear in multiple playlists, but they're all in at least one playlist. And I do have a playlist of my videos that is specifically for short rows. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here you will be able to find in a full technique video just devoted to that topic. But as we go over these things, you'll also be able to ask for some questions to clarify some things as well. Let's see. So what I want to do, a few weeks ago when I originally was scheduling this video, which I postponed till today, people were sending in the kinds of questions that they had about short rows, and it's really clear that there's a huge range of things that people are wanting to learn about. So it's a big spectrum, and I won't be able to cover every single thing today. I'm expecting this to go about an hour. So we'll see how that goes. But so I know that some of you know about short rows, but you don't really know how they work, and you're kind of maybe a little bit intimidated by them, and so you haven't even tried any projects that use short rows. And then there's other people who have done a number of projects that incorporate short rows, and you kind of understand what they're for, but you don't really understand what's going on. Like, you can follow the instructions and you can get the result, but you don't really know how these things work. And then there are some people who have a better idea of how short rows work and what they're used for, but you're not sure about how to add them in your own projects. So I'm hoping to go through all of that today, and so you can get a better feel for what short rows are and how they're used, and then feel better about using them yourself. I also want to talk a little bit about short row techniques. So that would be wrap and turn short rows, or German short rows, or shadow wrap short rows, those things, and how those techniques fit into the concept of short rows. Because when you understand that, then you will be able to substitute one type of short row for another. So if you have a pattern that's calling for wrap and turn short rows, but you really prefer to use German short rows, you'll have a better understanding of how to approach those kinds of substitutions. So quickly, I'm going to look through and see if there are any introductory questions before I get started. I'm also probably going to be taking my glasses off so that I can actually read up close. I am seeing that people are here from all over the world. We've got Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is my home state, India, Atlanta, Georgia, Virginia, the UK, California. I think Denmark. I saw somebody, I think, from Australia. There's UK, Portland, Canada. So people from all over the place. So then there's all of the business about no sound. Got the sound. Okay, so let's get started, you guys. I'm going to be switching to my little overhand or overhead camera in between, and you should still be able to see a picture of me up in the upper right hand corner while I'm doing this. So first of all, let's talk about what are short rows and what are they for. Short rows are a shaping technique. They're a vertical shaping technique in the way that increases and decreases are used to do horizontal shaping. So if you want the fabric to be narrower or wider over a certain number of rows, you can do increases or decreases. And short rows are used to add vertical shaping to fabric. So when you have, let's say you have 100 stitches on the needles, and when you work across all of those stitches, those are long rows. You're working across every single stitch. And when you work across an entire row, every column of stitches becomes another row longer. Short rows, you're only working across some of the stitches, and so only some of the columns of stitches are getting extra length. So let me just show you some examples of that. Let me switch. Okay. So here's an example of a piece of fabric where we've creases. So I am making the width of this fabric wider and wider. I'm adding increases right inside the edges, and then straight, and then I did decreasing. So these columns of stitches are all being maintained like this, and getting new columns of stitches over on the right. So that's how we use this and decreases to change the width. So here is a, can you see the whole thing? There we go. Something where I've used shaping in order to increase the length, and I've done it in this particular piece of fabric. I've done that up here near the bind off edge, down here near the cast on edge. So this is the place where I added the short rows. Everything in here are these maintained horizontal rows of fabric. So this is a way of pushing the edge up. So if you look at this little piece of fabric, you can see that we can do shaping with short rows and longer rows by binding off. Get a similar shape if we are using shape by binding off stitches, grabbing the center point. The center can end up longer, the part at the edges, but you stair step effect. So if this were going to be seen, you could hide this kind of stair edge, and this is kind of edge that you sometimes will like for shoulder shaping. But if the edge is going to be exposed, just want that edge to be smoother, make the thing easier, then use short row shaping. So this is one way. This is what I would consider two-dimensional short row shaping. But you can do short row shaping. You can do increases and decreases dimensionally to add three-dimensional shaping, and you can use short rows to do that as well. So here's kind of a classic use of short row shaping. The middle of a fabric is what something not happening.
Audio is kind of stuttering.
Oh, the audio's stuttering.
I think if you go to low res on this, maybe that.
Okay, so I'm gonna change the resolution of this, and maybe that will be helpful. Hopefully.
And
So
can we see the live comments if the audio is any better?
it's right here. The live comments are right here.
Yeah, but you're scrolled up, aren't you?
Oh. Okay, let's see. All right, is the audio any better? My sound is still not working. I wonder if we should just start this over.
No.
Well, someone's saying it's better. It's Go back. This is the worst.
Technical
This is the
difficulties.
worst. I'm so sorry, you guys.
Well, maybe hold it up to the webcam.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna have to. I guess I'm gonna have to.
Improvise.
Yeah, we're gonna have to turn off the iPhone, I guess.
Well, I think the audio is okay when you're on the webcam. It's just when you switch.
It's just when I switch to the
Yeah.
iPhone, then. But should I just turn that off then? Okay.
Can
Completely gone now. Fine now.
Can you show this to the
Yeah.
webcam and
Let's
have
see.
it usable?
Let's see if I can do this. Okay. All right. So let's continue on. Sorry. All right. So where was I? Okay. So sometimes you want the shaping to not be at the top or the bottom of an edge. You want it to be in the middle of the fabric. So with a sock, we do that. You can see that right in the middle. We create a heel, and we can do that with short rows by causing the short rows to create fabric. Let me put this on top of here so that I can lift this up so that we can create fabric that will extend out from the tube. And in a sweater, we can do that by using what are called bust darts. So we can create 3 dimensions in the bust. And so what we want to do then is keep all of the other fabric even and horizontal and just create extra room in the bust or extra room in the heel. So there are a couple of different ways that we can use short rows to create more room in different places, either at the top and the bottom or in the middle. So, now, and we do this, I wanted to point out, we do this with increases and decreases. One of the most common ways that we might do something like that with increases and decreases is with a mitten, where we keep all of the original stitches that we start with. All of those columns of stitches remain where they are, and all of the new stitches are coming out of the previous ones. They're all coming out this way. So that's how you can use this sort of shaping, whether it's increases and decreases or short row shaping. All right, so and this is going to be the trick with basic short rows and how I'm going to figure out how to do this. So if I'm working across a row and I just turn, so if I'm knitting across and I just stop at this point and I turn and I work in the other direction, I'm going to end up with 2 extra rows in the short row part where I'm only working those stitches. These stitches are going to have 2 rows more than the stitches over here. And what happens, 2 things happen with that. One is that you get a little hole at that transition point between where the short row end and the long rows continue past that. You get a hole there, but you also get, if you're working in stockinette stitch, you're going to get that same weird selvage stitch that you get when you work in stockinette all the way across the fabric. You know how all of your stitches in stockinette will look like V's, but those stitches on the very edges, you'll have one that looks like a V, and then you'll have another one that's kind of twisted and has a little bump or knot at the edge. And that's because when you work across, say, 10 stitches, when you get to stitch number 10, stitch number 10 is going to be the first stitch that gets worked on the next row. So you get that little weird bump in it. And that's what happens when you work across only some of the stitches of a row, and then you turn around and you work in the other direction. You get that weird selvage stitch. And that bump is going to be very visible on a smooth, flat fabric like stockinette is. And so we can use something called a short row technique that we apply to that turn in order to minimize that little hole that you get from the difference between the number of rows. You're cramming those extra 2 rows in between where the existing rows are. But it's also going to eliminate that selvage stitch. that little bump that you get. And we can do that in a bunch of different ways. So the purpose of a short row technique is to smooth out that fabric, to smooth out that turning point, and to minimize the hole. So the easiest way to do that is that when you get to the turning point, you turn and you just slip that very first stitch. What that does is, instead of ending up with 2 stitches at that turning point, so you don't have a stitch that looks like a V and a stitch that looks like a knot, you just have a stitch that looks like a V. It's an elongated V, but that bump is minimized, and so is that, or that bump is eliminated, and that hole is kind of minimized because that elongated slip stitch kind of fills in that space. So those are the 2 types of techniques that were used in really the first, all the way up to about the first half of the 20th century. When I look at those vintage patterns that I've been knitting in the past year and a half, short row turns were either just turn and work in the other direction, or is turn and slip a stitch. So the different techniques that we use operate on that turn in different ways, but ultimately the short row itself is just knitting up to a certain point and turning and going back in the other direction. So I'm trying to figure out how I can show you the stuff I was going to show you on the overhead. One second. Okay, so I think I can hold this up and you can see it. So when we're talking about just a simple turn, just turning and working in the other direction, I don't know how well you can see that, but in this stockinette fabric right here, you can kind of see where there's little bumps there, and that's where those little turns with the little selvage stitch bumps are. But if you look in seed stitch, you can't see that at all. If you look in garter stitch, you can see it a little more, and that really has to do with the fact that garter stitch is such a horizontal stitch pattern. You get these very strong ridges going across. So if you interrupt one of those ridges and turn and go the other way, it isn't that you're seeing a hole in the fabric, or it isn't that you're seeing a weird selvage stitch bump. What you're seeing is just that ridge ends. And so when you are working with a fabric like garter stitch or seed stitch, it's very possible you won't need to use any special technique at all. You might decide to use one, but you may not need to. So one of the really common techniques, and it was the technique that was in every pattern that I came across when I first started using short rows about 15 years ago, was the wrap and turn short row. And that is when you get to the point where you need to turn, and you wrap a loop of yarn around the next stitch. So if you are knitting across 10 stitches and you want to turn and go back the other way, then you're going to wrap the working yarn around stitch 11, and you have to do that by bringing the working yarn forward, or you move the working yarn, and you slip that stitch number 11, and then you move the working yarn again and slip that stitch back again, so that you've wrapped the working yarn around it. And what that does is it eliminates that little twist when you're turning in that point. And so instead of the stitch being worked right back into itself, like back into the top of itself, you've got a little loop of yarn going off to the side, so it can pretend like it's a regular stitch. So you've eliminated that little bump at the edge. But what you have is a little wrap. You've got a little horizontal strand of yarn across the front of the fabric. And that isn't a problem, again, if you are working with garter stitch or seed stitch, because you've got a whole bunch of little bumps all across that fabric. And so you can hide that turning point and with a wrap when you're working with one of those kinds of fabrics. When you are working with stockinette, you can see, again, you can see little blips on the face of the fabric where those little bumps are showing. So what we tend to do in stockinette fabric, because stockinette does have a right side and a wrong side, is that when we decide to work across those stitches later, we do something called picking up the wraps. And really what it is we're taking that little loop of yarn and we're hiding it on the back of the work so that when we work that stitch, you can't see it. So the wrap, a lot of times people think that the purpose of picking up the wrap is to prevent a hole. The hole has already been prevented. The purpose of picking up the wrap is purely an aesthetic reason. It's a choice to keep that stockinette fabric looking good. So I wish I could figure out how to demonstrate this better with the overhead. So I'm going to have to punt a little bit here. So I want to talk again about this idea of short row techniques are applied to a short row turn. So I have this chart which I will try to walk you through as I hold it up to the screen. So if we look at this top one right here, this is showing a chart that has 30 stitches, and it's showing that with these big arrows that we're working across back and forth across all of the stitches for 2 rows. And then on the 3rd row where you see this arrow right here, we're only going to work across 25 stitches, and we're going to turn and work the other way. And then when we get 5 stitches before the end of the row, we're going to turn and go the other way. And then we're going to stop again 5 stitches before, turn one more time, 5 stitches before, and then we're going to work across all of the stitches and all the way back again. So if we wanted to plan out a piece of fabric that looked like this, and we just wanted to use those turns, that is what we got right here when we just turned and went in the other direction, and it created this fabric that has this kind of bump over the top. It elongated it in the center. If we wanted to use something like a wrap and turn short row, then you can see right here, we would still be turning in the same location. We'd still be turning on stitch number 25, and it would be stitch number 26 that would get wrapped, and we'd work back in the other direction over here until there are 5 stitches remaining on the needle. But you can see that stitch number 5 is the one that gets wrapped. So the last 4 stitches and the first 4 stitches of the row are maintained the same, and it's that 5th stitch from each end that gets wrapped. So again, if we keep turning at those same locations, what we see is that we have a wrap, and then we have 4 stitches, and then we see the other wrap. These turns are 5 stitches apart, and they're in the same place that they were up here, but now we have some stitches that are wrapped. And that is what we had here. We had the same shape and the same result, but we just ended up with these little blips right here. So, but there are some techniques that are different than wrap and turn short rows, and one of them is my favorite method of short row turn, which is called German short rows, and I've done a number of videos on these. And so people get confused about how to substitute a German short row for a wrap and turn short row. And that's because when you work a German short row, you work up to the same turning point you would work to if you were just going to turn and go back the other direction, or if you were going to turn and wrap the adjacent stitch. But instead, you turn and you slip that stitch. Remember, I talked about how the sort of the earliest simple way of dealing with that turn so it's not bumpy was just turning and slipping the stitch. So you turn and you slip that stitch, And you do it so that the working yarn is in front, so that's toward you. And then you're going to pull that working yarn over the top of the needle, and it's going to pull that slip stitch, the kind of that purl bump at the base of that slip stitch over to the, so that's sitting on top of the needle, and it's going to look like there's two stitches there. We call that a double stitch. So that is the thing that is marking where the turn is. It's the stitch where you made the turn is the one that gets the double stitch. So if you were to look at that same swatch that we were working, where we're going all the way up to stitch 25 and we're turning, it's stitch number 25 that's going to get that double stitch. Where before with the wrap and turn, it was stitch number 26 that got the wrap. So these little markers on the needle, these little flags that tell you where the turn are in different places. So, but if you go back to the same turning point here and you turn and you slip the stitch and you create your double stitch, you're still turning in the same exact locations, but they're not, the flag is not in the same place. I'd like to think of it as like the place that you're turning is after you work that last stitch and before you would ever work the next stitch. So that turning point is actually between those two stitches. It's sort of like the double stitch of a German short row and the wrap and turn and the wrap of a wrap and turn short row are like if you have put flags on the banks of a river, but you've put one on the near bank and the other one is on a far bank. So they're still marking that same location, they're just in different places. But this can be confusing when you're trying to follow directions for wrap and turn short rows, but you want to use German short rows. So what I do is I map out, like this in a little chart, where the turns are in the original instructions so I can see where the actual turn is. And then I can map out where I'm turning and where I'm making my double stitch relative to the previous double stitch that I made before. That is how I do it. I don't try to do I don't try to place that double stitch where the wrap would have been, because then I'm moving my turn. I'm not substituting flags. I'm just changing the flag, but the river that goes between those flags is going to stay in the same place. And I do have a video on making these kinds of substitutions. I wish I could do this demonstration to show you different types of techniques, but there's really kind of two families of short row techniques. One family is based on creating some kind of a loop, like the wrap and turn or a yarn over or something like that, creating a piece of yarn across from where the turn is. It's almost like an increase. And then you get rid of that later. And the other family of short rows is related to turning and slipping a stitch. So the German short rows are like that, and Japanese short rows are like that. So when you are making a substitution from one family of short row to the other family of short row, you have to keep that in mind, and that's when you need to kind of chart things out. So I wish I could demonstrate this, but I can't. So let's see. Let's see if does anybody have any questions yet. Oh, here's one. Would like a rounded bottom of sweater. Do you start at the front, center, or at the side? Okay, so let me give you an example. I have my little thing back here. It's a little like shawlette that I designed that has what I think you're talking about. Let me get a piece of paper and I can kind of draw the shape that I think you are thinking of. Well, I think you're thinking of a shape that's like this, where it's down in the front like this. So the way I learned to understand short rows, I was trying them in all different kinds of projects for about 4 years, and I couldn't understand why sometimes you start with a really short row and they get longer and longer, and other times the short rows start out long and you're getting shorter and shorter. I couldn't figure out what was going on. So if you look at these pieces of fabric that I was showing you earlier, where if you actually started with just a few stitches and then you wanted to cast on more because you wanted it to be wider, you can see that the center would have the most stitches, and you're starting with those center stitches and then you're gradually adding stitches to the width, wider and wider. So I'll draw this out for you. What you do if you want to convert that to short rows is you cast on all of the stitches. You could work one full row. You could work a couple of rows if you wanted. So you cast on, you work some stitches, and then you go to the center and you find you do short rows that mark the narrowest or the center part that's going to be the longest. So you do your turn like that. So you're establishing that center part there. And then you get longer and longer like that. And so the center part's going to get longer and these parts are going to get, the center part's going to be the longest vertically, and then as you get the longer and longer rows horizontally, it's going to bring this first cast on edge, it's going to bring that up, and that's what's going to curve around the bottom. Likewise, if you want something that goes up like that, you start out with the longest rows and then you get shorter and shorter. So what I figured out to do was to draw the shape that I wanted. So let's say I wanted a shape that looked like this. How would I fill that up with rows? Well, the ones on the bottom would be shorter, and then the ones on the top are going to get wider and wider and longer. And so that's how I finally figured out, okay, this is how to make things wider and wider and get the shape that I wanted. If you wanted something that scoops down like this, and you started with the long short rows and got shorter and shorter, and then you went back to working longer and longer rows, that bottom edge would still kind of scoop down, but those rows that formed that scoop down there would not be horizontal. They would be kind of distorted in a curved way. So it's not that you can't do short rows the other way, but it's probably not going to give you the appearance that you want. So let me just show you this scarf here. So this is a scarf that is wider in the center, and it gets narrower at the edges, the stockinette portion. So the way I knit this was a strip that I knit vertically like that, and then I picked up stitches all along that vertical edge, and then I did short rows. So what I did was I figured out how deep do I want that center part, and how wide do I want that widest center part to be, and then how long do I want it all together, and how narrow do I want that narrowest part to be. And then I look at, well, how many stitches do I have going off in this direction and in that direction, and how many rows do I need to work in order to get down to the smallest number, like. And so then I can say, well, let me do another drawing. So let's say I wanted that crescent shape, and this part here in the middle, this is the part that I want to be the full length, and let's say I wanted that to be 32 rows, and I want it to go down to 1 or 2 rows at each end like that. That means every set of short rows that I'm working creates 2 rows. So I'm going to have like 15 sets of short rows. So I'm going to have 15 turns in order to reduce the stitches down to 1 row. So if I have, say, 105 stitches over there and I have 15 turns, that means every 7 stitches is where the short row turn is going to be. So you have to just figure out how many rows you want the longest part to be and how many stitches you have in order and how many turns that you're going to need to make across those number of stitches to figure out how long and how far to space them out. I wish I could do this on the overhead. It would be a lot easier, but that's how you kind of calculate that scoop at the bottom. Okay, let's see if there's any other questions. Okay, so someone says, about to start my first sweater, has a curved bottom with short rows, but only says to turn, no wrap, no slips, no nothing. Help, please. Should I swap or add wraps or go during Japanese? So if your pattern is telling you to turn and it doesn't say that you need to do a wrap or it doesn't say to do any kind of technique, what I would do is look at what the stitch pattern is and do a swatch and see what happens if you just turn and go back in the other direction. Because you might be surprised. When I was making these little swatches a few years back, when I did that seat stitch swatch, I was really surprised that there was no hole. And the reason there really isn't a hole, in part, is because the row gauge is so compressed that hole that you get in the stockinette just isn't as obvious. And you've got those purl bumps that are obstructing the view. So it really depends on what the stitch pattern is. And so if you can look at the photograph, or if the pattern is on Ravelry, I would go on Ravelry and look at who else has made that project and see if there's any comments about it, see what people have done with short rows. But there could be a very good reason why there's no specific technique that is being applied to that turn. Okay. How do you calculate the number of rows between short rows? Oh, typically, when you are working a series of short rows, you're not working long rows in between. You are working consecutive short rows until you have completed all of them. So the number of short rows that you need to work in order to complete the whole sequence is dependent on how many rows that you want to work for the period of time that you're doing short rows. So in the example of a crescent like this, the entire thing is short rowed. If you have just a crescent shape and then you want to work vertically, well, how long do you want that middle part of the crescent to be? That tells you how many rows that you're working, that you're short rowing, but you need to figure out then how many stitches to extend past the previous turn based on the number of stitches you have divided by the number of short rows sets that you are working. Question: how to calculate for dowager's hump? And so that is kind of this curve at the back here, which might require you to need more length. So if you have a I guess to me the easiest way would be to put something on that you already own that is pulling up in the back, because if it's needing to pull up in the back in order to cover that, it's probably bringing the hem up, and you might be able to see how much it's pulling up, and that can help you. If you look at the shape of what's getting pulled up, that could help you calculate how much additional short row shaping you might need in the back there. That's how I would approach it at the start. Another way is to just measure from the place right here down the center of your back and see what that total length is that you need for the back versus what you need at the side of your shoulder. So that will tell you how steep you need to make that shoulder shaping. Question, my sweater is just stockinette, so I guess I need to choose another. Oh, I'm not sure exactly what that was referring to. How do you add short rows to raise the back of a sweater if the pattern doesn't have that written in? It kind of depends on what type of sweater it is and if you're talking about a sweater that's worked with like set-in sleeves or drop shoulders or something like that, where you're working the shoulders up to, and you have them seamed here, that's different than if you are working something like a yoke sweater. So there's kind of different approaches. I have a book. I just bought the new version of it. I was looking it up. Looking some things up in here. It's called Knitting in the Old Way, and they kind of have formulas in here for adding short rows for like yoke shoulders and in order to raise the neck up. But other types of sweaters won't have that. But some of those circular sweaters are assuming that everything is even, and people want to be able to raise the neck up. And usually for those types of situations, you're starting the short rows somewhere here, and and then you are working the turns, and so you might do I don't know, depends on what yarn weight you're working with, anywhere between 3 and 5 turns, or maybe more if you're working with fingering weight. It just depends. But some people do those right here in the ribbing. They'll do that, and so the back of the ribbing will be longer, and other people will do it when they get to the bottom of the yoke. They'll work so that the ribbing is exactly the same everywhere, and the yoke is worked, and then they'll put the short row shaping if they have a solid color underneath that, and then that will help to raise the back as well. Let's see. Oh, okay. So just another Bucky lover. You were talking about the sweater that doesn't have any wraps. Yeah, if it was stockinette and they're just telling you to turn, that I would still wonder why they're doing that. And if you can see photos, if you can see a good photo of their finished thing there, it could be some reason why they're wanting to do that. I would always question that. Or you might even email the designer and ask them about that. Sometimes I have seen patterns sometimes that will talk about where to turn, and then they'll just tell you to use whatever technique that you prefer, and it's up to you to do that. So if you're working in stockinette and it's smooth and it looks like that's going to be exposed, I probably would use a technique. I understand the concept of wrap and turn and how to execute, but is there a standard? Every time I watch YouTube, it is done differently. Oh, you mean in terms of whether you move the yarn and then slip the stitch, or if you slip the stitch and then move the yarn? I tend to see instructions say to move the yarn and then slip. I have a friend who I consider a very expert knitter. She goes by Schrouder Knits on Ravelry. Her name is Joan Schrouder. She will sometimes do it the opposite. Again, this is one of those things where swatching can help you determine what your preference is, because it kind of doesn't matter in a way if there is a standard, because you may not like the process of the way the standard is worked, or you just may prefer the result of doing it the non-standard way. So if I were you, I would do a swatch. I know Joan talks about with garter stitch, she likes to just keep, so she doesn't want the yarn to kind of loop around it so that it crosses. She just has it loop around, so it just does like a U-turn without crossing itself. So I would do a swatch and see which you prefer. I remember doing that years ago, and then I decided what I really hated was wrap and turn, and I wanted to find something else besides that. Question from Heidi. So in the scarf example, you started with 1 wood turn, 7 stitches from each end, then 14 stitches and 21 okay, so let me get another piece of paper. And I'm going to draw this to make it like this. So if you want this center span to be, say, 20 stitches, you would, and you'd have to work 10 stitches past the center and then 10 stitches past the center in the other direction, so that was 20 stitches. So you've established this center here with those 2 turns, that one and that one. And then each time you would go 7 stitches past the previous turn if it was 7 stitches, and then 7 stitches past that previous turn. Each time, or whatever your increments are. And sometimes things aren't going to divide up exactly, and so you might have to do 7 turns for a while, 7 stitches past for a while, and maybe you have to do 8 stitches past for a while in order for everything to even out. Okay, let's see. Let's see. Any more questions? Is one technique better than another for Continental versus English? I find that German short rows are easier with Continental. It can be done with English, but it just there's just a little bit trickier to keep the double stitch in place. But otherwise, like, it's always try it out and see which technique you like the result of, which process you like, which one makes sense to you, and then which one works with your knitting style, because that's going to vary from knitter to knitter. I can't tell you it's always going to be easier for Continental. It's easier for me when I'm knitting Continental, and it's harder for me when I'm knitting my method of knitting English, which is not the same as a lot of other people. So it really just depends on your knitting style. I understand the concept. Oh, and that's already. Where did I get my shirt? Oh, I think it was one of those. It was a Facebook ad, if you can believe it. I think it knows that I like knitting things, and it feeds me. Your internet's always spying on you, and it fed me one of these. I think. Probably just shirt generating companies, but I got it from Facebook. I don't know what company I got it from. You could probably just Google "I'm a simple woman" and then description of the 3 things and knitting and probably find it. But I really have no idea. I just went, oh, I want that, click, and I bought it. Okay. Let's see. Which short row sock heel looks best with the least holes to you? So when I knit short row heels, which I don't do very often, I much prefer working a peasant heel. I think short row heels, I don't like them. But so I will use a German short rows. And I will use a technique where in the middle of when I've done all of my, I'm at my shortest short row, I've knit the little triangle, you know, the first half of the hourglass. Um, I will knit 2 rows, not 2 rounds, which is what usually you do with German short rows. I do 2 rows. So when I'm setting up my short rows, I leave that last stitch. I don't knit all the way to the last stitch and create a double stitch in it at the beginning at each end. I stop 1 stitch short, same place you'd stop if you were working wrap and turn short rows, because you'd have to wrap that last stitch. So I leave those last stitches so that they're just regular. And then when I get to the center part, I work across all of the stitches and I create my double stitch at the end there, work across all of them, create the double stitch at the very end, and then I start working the longer and longer short rows from the center. I have a video on this. I have a video called German Short Row Sock Heels 3 Ways, and where I talk about what the classic hourglass heel is and how it works, and then 3 different ways of working German short rows. So the other way that I like to do German short row sock heels is to work the first half, doing double stitch all the way at the very first and the very last, and going up into the center. And then when I work the second half, rather than I work my double stitch, turn, and I slip that stitch, and I don't do a double stitch. So I do slip stitches on the second half very firmly. So I do like the look of that as well. I don't like doing rounds where I'm interrupting because if I'm using self-striping or something. But those are my preferences. They may not be your preferences, but I do have a video that talks about 3 ways. There is a 4th way of doing German short row sock heels, which I didn't include in that video because I think it's creates an ugly result, but it's one that some people do use, which is to work the second half of the heel, also working a double stitch immediately. I just think it looks unattractive. To me, it looks like a mistake, but if that's what you like, you can do it that way. And so again, what the best result, the best looking short row heel is based on the results that you like, not the results that I like. Question: if you want an eyelet when knitting a sock heel on the diagonal, it's going too fast. What short row do you use and how is it done? If you want an eyelet, I would just do a turn and go in the other direction because you'd get that hole there. If you want an eyelet there, just don't use any technique at all. Please enumerate names of all short row techniques that you know so that beginners know what to Google. Again, I have a video on comparing short row techniques that show kind of, it compares them all, but these are the ones that there are. There's just the simple turn, there's the turn and slip one, there's the wrap and turn, there's the, and then there's the yarn over short row. Then there's shadow wrap short row. These are the short row turns that are used in that Fish Lips Kiss heel. She says they're not shadow wraps and that shadow wraps are different. There may be more than one method of working a shadow wrap short row, but the shadow wrap method I know is the one that she's using in her sock heel, so I don't know. So then there's Japanese, and again, there seems to be a couple of different versions of Japanese short rows out there. And then there's the German short rows, and that's the one I was talking about earlier where there's a double stitch. And some of the ones that produce the same result may have different techniques that are used in order to create them. So I think there's other short row techniques that people use that I sometimes look at and I think, oh, that seems a little more fiddly than I want. I mean, the reason I loved Japanese or German short rows is because they gave the same result as Japanese short rows. That's why I actually named them. I'm the one who named them German short rows. I didn't invent the technique, but there was from a book translated from German, and they had some long description of it. And so I thought, well, it's the same result as Japanese short rows. Might as well call them German short rows. those are the ones that I know of and use. I use wrap and turn sometimes, and the reason I use it is because it's in a situation where I'm going to leave the wrap. And sometimes, like if I'm doing a garter stitch or something, I'll just do a wrap and turn. It hides on both sides. So if it's a reversible fabric, it's essentially invisible on both sides. There are occasions when a pattern has called for wrap and turn short rows, and I'm like, oh, well, I'm not going to use those. I'm going to substitute German short rows. And it turns out the reason they wanted wrap and turn short rows was they were not picking up the wraps, and they were used for a decorative purpose. In fact, the turn was made in the same exact spot, so you were getting more and more wraps. And I was making a little like stuffed birdie, like it was a cat toy, and those wraps were forming the edge of the bird wing on the surface of the fabric, and I didn't realize that. So when I substituted the for German short rows, it was a much subtler effect. It wasn't nearly as cute as it would have been if I had used the wrap and turn. Let's see. Again, if you have questions, start the question with in all caps with the word question so I can find them, because otherwise it's going to be really hard. Which short row sock kills? Okay, I already answered that. I may have missed some questions, but it's been about an hour. And sorry about the various technical difficulties. Hopefully I can get them ironed out for next time. I imagine I might end up doing another short row video at some point where I could actually do some overhead and demonstration for you. So if there are any last minute questions, please let me know now. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining me. And again, sorry about the technical difficulties. And I will see you next time. Thanks so much.